Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the TF podcast, where we discuss technology, finance around the topics of blockchain, Bitcoin, and cryptocurrency. Please make sure that you are subscribed on your favorite podcast channel, as well as on our YouTube and on our site. You can follow me at JG Product and at TF Blockchain. I'm really excited for our next guest. He has been a big supporter of what we've been doing with our conferences and events for several years, actually since the very beginning. You were at the very first event. And we've actually had him speak at events in the past. So with that, I'd love to welcome Bob Cornish with Anderson Kill. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good to be here.
Yeah, Bob. I'd love if you could. And should I call you Bob or Robert? I
Bob
was
is good.
okay. I always call you Bob. So Bob, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself real quick to everybody. Kind of let them know what you've been doing.
Sure. Well, I've been practicing securities law for 25 years. Have served as in-house counsel for an institutional money manager, family office, and have worked at several large law firms during my career. Uh, Most of my work has been in the investment advisor and broker-dealer area. Worked with hedge funds, commodity traders, and in recent times, I've been contacted by people overseas and in the US to assist them in the digital asset area,
Yeah.
and trying to make uh, make sense, I suppose, of uh, melding regulation that might not necessarily look at first that it fits into what someone's trying to do, but lo and behold, a lot of people are starting more and more to reach out to council to get a good feel for what not only the feds require, but the states as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm excited to dig into that. Before we do, I want to talk about, the 25 years in securities law. So what kind of got you into that to begin with, or sparked your interest in that side of things? You have an accounting or finance background as well?
Actually, it was by accident, really. Before I went to law school, I served as a paralegal at a large New York law firm. And the attorney that I was assigned to work with was the former general counsel of a very large broker dealer based in New York. And this was around the time right after the '87 market crash, when there was litigation over margin debits and trading that really was kind of left over from the Baba boom days of everybody trading like crazy in the '80s.
Yeah.
And that's really how I became involved in the securities area. I was lucky enough to have a mentor in my career who let me make my mistakes, learn the industry, and learn the craft of being an attorney, and that's served me very well during my career. So
Yeah.
uh, it's been an interesting road.
I bet. I bet. So I mean that's definitely that was Black Monday, right? When in
Yes.
the '87 crash. Yeah. They even have a Showtime show about that now.
Yeah.
So,
Everyone looking at very large video screens and uh, green and white paper coming out of printers. I mean, it was just a different time.
sure, sure. So that's yeah, it's great that you kind of had that entry point. And then so as you've been, in securities law, like you said, over the last 25 years, I'd love to understand like why you got interest in the digital asset space. Obviously like in the last, 4 or 5 years, a lot of people were like trying to shoehorn essentially digital assets into securities law. And so I'm assuming that you probably had, hey, I know the law on securities, like that's not a security or that is or whatever. So I love if you could kind of touch on that real quick.
Well, like most things in the law, you end up coming onto them by accident. I know some folks, make a conscious effort to learn more and more about a certain area, and then, hope to develop their expertise. Uh, I was pretty lucky in that uh, I was introduced to a potential client by another lawyer I know very well, who essentially sent an email out to 100 of his closest friends and said, "Does anybody know anything about trading currency and commodities?" And I said, "Of course I do. I used to work at a firm that did that." So I wrote to my friend and I said, "Yes, I can probably help you." And lo and behold, this was somebody who was looking to not only trade Bitcoin, but to bank it, and was interested in what was going on in Puerto Rico.
Hmm.
So I had a crash course really in learning about what people were doing with Bitcoin and digital assets and cryptocurrency. My only experience really before that was actually briefly speaking to a prospect. I think this was back in 2010, who approached me about putting together a Bitcoin fund.
Hmm.
I remember the issue I had was my law firm wouldn't let me accept $10,000 of Bitcoin in 2010, which
Yeah.
I somewhat regret at this point in my life. But
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that would have been a small dollar amount per Bitcoin on that. $10,000. Yeah. You'd be good. You'd be good. Well, assuming you didn't sell, right? But hopefully you would held on to it.
yeah.
So very cool. So, I'd love to just understand, when call it 4 years ago, 5 years ago, you had a lot of cryptocurrencies coming about that were saying that they weren't securities, and they were issuing out
Mhm.
utility tokens, but they were also behaving like securities. Real quick, to just kind of level set the conversation, can you kind of just touch on that real quick? What would be the difference between that? Is there even such thing as a utility token from the legal perspective?
Well, depending on any point in time, you could say there is. I'm actually a believer that there still is a place for the utility token. I'm not necessarily certain that it's something that should be offered to investors,
You're right.
but there are things out there that can be created that have value that can be, dumped in the jukebox, so to speak, to have an input or an output. Um, it has changed. One of the problems you have, I think, in new and emerging areas of securities law, and I've seen it in the dot-com era, I've seen it in immigration investment, is that there is a strong rush by a lot of people to suddenly seize that first mover opportunity and monetize it as quickly as they can.
Hmm.
And sometimes the answers that they seek aren't the ones that lawyers will give them. And I think that's sort of where things went a little awry with the SAFT. There are a great number of securities attorneys out there that frankly didn't benefit from doing a lot of work in the digital space simply because they refused to do SAFs for the very reasons that we now see have that have caused their criticism,
Yeah.
caused people to be critical of them. Um, there were other people who were, I guess, a little more bullish and maybe a little naive in terms of how regulators would look at these things. And, um, so some of those folks are still in the business of advising firms and advising players in the markets. But I think what you've seen in the last couple of years is a migration of the more serious, compliance minded people in the digital space steer towards working with attorneys with a compliance background and who generally try to keep things close to the vest.
Hmm.
One of the things attorneys generally try to do is, you want to find a solution for the problem that the client brings to you. While you hopefully don't have to say no, you certainly want to be able to exhaust your options and exhaust the possibilities, not only from a legal standpoint, but perhaps from a business standpoint. As you know, so many people have thought about digital assets, and frankly, does it even make sense for their business at all? Just because something can be digitized doesn't necessarily mean that it's a really good idea. And I think we've
Sure.
seen that over the last year or two.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a few of those flame out, and kind of going along with what you're saying is the ones that have been able to, for the most part, stay true. Most likely actually had some good legal representation. Kind of helping them on along the way. Um, Interesting.
Mhm.
I'd love to move it into present day.
I
So,
think a lot.
oh, go ahead.
Mhm. No, I think a lot of that's going to. I think that a lot of that's good for the industry, really.
I totally agree.
Uh, I think more. I'm a big believer that institutions that are looking for alpha and alternative portfolios are going to be steering towards digital at some point.
Hmm.
It's just a matter of how ready this industry is to be subject to institutional scrutiny,
Right.
and working with counsel that knows what they're doing and takes a measured approach and has worked with institutions in the past is I think a pretty good move by those people who are looking to the next now,
Yeah.
not the present.
Totally. So speaking of institutions, there's quite a few financial institutions that are thinking about, how they digitize their assets, or create their own stable currencies, for their
Mhm.
network. Love if you kind of touch on that a little bit from the legal perspective, and then just frankly from what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, we go back to the utility token subject. We think about the first thing that comes to mind is what JP Morgan is doing right now
Yeah.
with the creation of their own dollar for the transactions within the bank that are being used already on systems that people are examining for all sorts of things in the retail and the public space, I suppose. What I think this portends is that banks are going to be more and more the leaders in the use of these assets simply because from a data standpoint, especially those entities like JP Morgan that um, intersect the borders of financial services and banking. When I say financial services, I mean essentially everything but banking. And then
Mhm.
you have the banking on the other side. That plus all of the Dodd-Frank requirements in terms of asset segregation, risk management, so on and so forth, are going to really require these banks to create more sound, swift means of settling transactions. And if there's a way for them to do that through using their own digital currencies, I don't see why the banking community and the banking regulators wouldn't get on board with that.
Yeah.
I think where you have issues, of course, are when these coins are out there in the public and people, pretend to say things about them that uh, may not be as truthful as it ought to be.
Sure.
Um, I
Yeah.
don't know if you'll ever see, if you're dealing with a JP Morgan bond, I mean, people do a credit analysis on a JP Morgan bond. I don't know if we're going to get to the point where somebody, a fixed income manager or an investment manager is ever going to have to do an analysis, so to speak, on a JP Morgan coin for the purpose of investment return.
Yeah.
But
Bec-
what
bec-
I
yeah.
do think,
And that's because of its stable nature of how it's
exactly,
designed. Yeah.
exactly. These are going to be instruments that are going to be used as proxies, really, for bank capital or capital moving in and out of the bank in a very swift manner, with a swaps transaction or a settlement of a derivative, one side of a derivative trade. You're starting to see some firms do more of that on the security side, which I think is a good thing. Nomura, the Japanese firm, is a leader in that. I saw that Nasdaq has reached an arrangement with another service provider to start some development of digital assets that might actually be compatible with some of the reporting systems of the Nasdaq stock market.
Hmm.
Um, there's all kinds of things that people are dipping their toe in, so to speak, to have, I guess, maybe not the business solution to a certain problem that they're looking to solve, but to have the knowledge of how this technology works and how it can be applied to solve a problem that they do not yet know of.
Sure.
Um, Clearly, somebody out there is going to take the lead in how the digital world is going to be uh, molded and created, and how it's going to interact with our banking system.
Yeah.
And as we go to conferences and meet people in the digital world, I think there's a reality check that folks are having that you can't have a financial system without some kind of banking structure, as much as you would like to have everything totally decentralized and have everything peer to peer. I don't think that defeats the nature of peer to peer purely, uh, but there are just some things that people are going to have to be doing with an intermediary with a balance sheet, until the banking world changes, until the accounting world changes, until the securities markets change. The technology is actually quite ahead of where our markets are right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because what's super clear on the digital currency side, for a banking institution, is that a lot of the drivers for it are improving business and technology operations, right? I think it's less about even trying to be innovative or competitive in the sense of, from like a cryptocurrency standpoint. It's
Right.
more of like, oh wow, thank you, Bitcoin, or thank you, cryptocurrencies, for showing us that we could
Mhm.
do something a little bit better, which I actually think is kind of like a compliment to the crypto, like, Bitcoin, right? Is that like, hey, like, we can actually move money a little bit quicker if we do it in this means. Now, is it, like you're saying, like, is this a decentralized thing? Is this something that people are going to use for self-sovereign, money and that sort of course not, like that, not at all. But this does solve a business need for the bank so that they can send money, to each other easier and so forth. um, with that, we have some talks about like a US digital dollar, right? Which would essentially be similar in nature, right? In the sense that it would be some level of stable coin for easy transfer of money as well. I mean, everybody just got $1,200, for the most part, either by check or, direct deposit. I imagine that in a digital dollar context, we'd all get, USD, Fed coin or something, to our wallets. What are your kind of thoughts overall on like the digital dollar from a government standpoint?
Well, I definitely think it has a future in some manner. I'd almost say that we have digital dollars, so to speak, already in our treasury markets.
Hmm.
The way that uh, the treasury bills and treasury notes are actually traded, you don't really have a heck of a lot of paper.
Hmm.
And most trading by its nature right now, there's very little paper involved. I mean, but you're still dealing with all of these legacy systems for
Sure.
trade settlements, order entry, custodianship, that are remnants of of a paper age. One of the, I guess, more charming financial crises that comes to mind is something called the paper crisis. That when Wall Street was shut down uh, for days because there were too many order tickets and trade confirmations that needed to be generated, and trades were just not being settled fast enough, which was ultimately the driver of the creation of the Depository Trust Corporation, all the settlement procedures we now have in SEC and FINRA rules. Uh, there's going to be a point where some of that's going to come back, I think, and ultimately, this, the lessons that we've learned from Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in terms of being able to settle quickly and transfer quickly are going to have to be applied. But I think the larger question is really where the digital marketplace participants really want to be. There's, of course, there are people in the digital world who totally want to be off the radar. There are others who wish to, be an ancillary part of the financial markets. And then there are others who really want to be in the middle of it. Um, Myself, I think that there is a place for uh, a sovereign hedge that an investor or an institution can deploy to avoid, massive pandemic, to use a term pandemic, but massive global risks that uh, that would have um, an investment that isn't correlated to broad markets globally, but has more of has more of the characteristics of something that's um, somewhat inversely related, I suppose, um, or like not quite a safe haven like gold, but pretty close to it. Um, Very different model with something that's actually being used as a means of trade,
Hmm.
widely used. And I think that's really where a lot of this will will come to fruition is when you see greater acceptance of digital assets and cryptocurrencies as means of exchange in the markets. It's great that we have all this Bitcoin floating around, but how many people are really using it to purchase items? um, there's still a fear that, yeah, I can take, it's just like if I had a $20 gold coin, I'm not going to use that $20 gold coin to buy $20 worth of groceries. It's the same thing with Bitcoin because there is a perception of its value being something more than it might represent in dollars. So you tend to hoard it or use it as a store of value. And until there is more, I think, transactional traffic with this stuff, it's going to be pretty hard to get the asset to have the correlation and trading activity that would engender it to be a true sovereign hedge. But I think that's where it ought to be going and where it should go.
Got it. Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that you know there's definitely a need for a sovereign hedge.
Mhm.
Perhaps it is Bitcoin, but maybe not necessarily like right now kind of thing. Yeah, I think it's interesting because what I find interesting overall on the digital dollar is like no doubt that's going to happen. Like you can fight it all you want, that's going to happen, right? And so I guess for me, that's what makes Bitcoin interesting. Sorry, not the only thing, obviously, but like it's just like one more notch in the belt as to my belief and why I'm so bullish when it comes to Bitcoin is like kind of going along with you what you're saying is about being that sovereign hedge. I definitely believe in it as a sovereign hedge. Um, and exactly, it's like there might be some aspects that you want to keep in a more um, um, private or sovereign way and be in control of it, where you still obviously need to live in the current system, right? Like we're not at the point just yet where like you're saying, you're transacting this way. So no matter what, we're all going to have to, if digital dollars come out, we're all going to have to use digital dollars, right? Like that's just where the world is today. But kind of, I guess, to go one step further for you, like again, that's for me like why I'm super interested. One of the reasons I'm super interested in Bitcoin is to have a little
Mhm.
bit of that sovereign edge overall. How do you see from even from like a legal standpoint or just in general, how do you see Bitcoin playing with a digital dollar? Do you think it's just two set, like they live in two separate worlds, or is it that uh, will banking institutions or even the government start thinking about how to kind of have that pair, just like a stable coin in an exchange might be a pair, for the Bitcoin overall?
No, I think there's definitely a future where you're going to see financial institutions doing swaps and other transactions with dollars on one side and Bitcoin on the other,
Yeah.
whatever reason, whether it's risk management or the generation of investment return.
Yeah.
Um,
There's definitely a margin opportunity, right? So then it becomes a business opportunity as well.
exactly. The issue becomes, again, how many people are really using it? And is it concentrated in the hands of a few, or is it really something that is broadly accepted and held by a variety of investors and participants in the financial markets? There is still enough correlation right now with uh, Bitcoin because of, I think, because of a what I would call a relatively thin trading market. Um, Not in terms of dollars, but just in terms of volume. Uh, the idea that you do have people who look at this asset as something to be mined or as something to be hoarded or kept in a kept in a safe or a wallet.
Hodled sounds so much better than hoarded. I just,
Yeah, hodl it. Yeah, yeah, I would tend to agree. I would tend to agree, but but there is an issue though in terms of how if you truly want this asset, you start getting into these esoteric market arguments about what is the market of bit, what is the market indicating right now, and what is it really showing what the activity is of people and their belief in the value of what this asset really represents.
Mhm.
It's only represented by those who are buying and selling. You do have people who are on the one side, using this clearly as a store of value. You have others who are trying to get mass adoption going. And then in the middle, you have a lot of people just trying to trade and make a lot of money. That's created this kind of weird whipsaw um, scenario where you see a lot of people trading Bitcoin. Uh, their trading will correlate a lot to the broader markets
Mhm.
in terms of when they buy, when they sell. And then you have the issue, of course, of how margin issues affect all of that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, we
we
definitely
know,
saw that on March 12th, right? When there's a sell-off.
right, and we know that there are exchanges out there and others who will grant anywhere from 100 to 200 times leverage for someone to trade. The question is, are those folks really trading? Are they using those assets to actually go out to the market and buy the Bitcoin? And one of the things I'm curious about is if you take the leverage that's in the market right now for Bitcoin, how much of that leverage truly is such that the exchange has gone to a provider of hard money and actually has that capital to lever in the first place for other people to use.
Hmm.
It's a phenomenon in the currency markets because currencies by their nature trade 24/7. There's no real issue in terms of a trade of a US dollar for a yen not going through.
Mhm.
I mean, at any given point during the day, that trade can happen. And because of that, there are plenty of FX firms that will give you a lot of leverage. Um, I think people have tried to use that model with Bitcoin. The problem is that you just don't have that kind of volume. And in order for folks to perceive that they're getting the same pop that they would get trading dollars or yen or loonies or whatever, you see some of these exchanges, you know, being very bullish on the granting of leverage, whether it's real or imagined.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of that, I think a lot of that's going to flush out in the next couple of years. And I think some of it will actually improve as Bitcoin's price tends to accelerate. I think you'll see a lot more interest in people actually being able to lend to exchanges and others so that margin privileges could be extended in a degree, in a manner and degree that are truly in line with what's going on in the broad markets.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, super interesting overall. Definitely, it's been great to see the Bitcoin, trading market, continue to mature, but there's still more maturing, on the way naturally, overall. But I one thing I think is really interesting. It's too early to say, but there has been like a slight, decoupling actually right now. So Bitcoin's been going steadily up
Yes.
since March 12th. I think it's right around 9,000 right now. And the stock market's gone up and down. And even in this most recent, run up from like 7 to 9 for Bitcoin, stock market's actually been going down. So that's actually been pretty interesting. We'll see how that works out for the rest of the month. And I'm looking forward to for good and bad reasons, I guess, Q2 earnings to see just what happens. I mean, we all know that they're going to be terrible, but I'll be interested to see how the markets respond, to that overall, because
Yeah, well,
everything seems crazy right now. The way the markets are responding to bad news just doesn't seem correct.
no, no. I mean, the markets. Oh, yeah, people still have salary. People who are employed still have 401ks where they're depositing money every month, and those funds in those programs are buying stocks.
Yeah.
Um, you still have people, looking for, buying bargains. You have people who clearly have cash and liquidity needs. You have companies that are using their equity, to keep themselves afloat at this moment.
Yeah.
So it's a very volatile market, and you also have people who are um, very adept at taking advantage of this volatility through the use of options and futures. I think, for every group that says they've hit that winning trade and making a bet on the market doing X or Y, there are probably 20 on the other side of the trade that are, losing their shirts.
Hmm.
So, you know, I think a lot of folks may well have thought that the market would be continually going down for the next month or so. You did have March, end of March, obviously end of the first quarter. You have, there was just not much that these managers could do to get numbers to a place where they looked good at all. I mean, there was really nowhere to run for a lot of these managers. But as you mentioned, the March 12th timing of that run versus uh, the end of the first quarter and what's going on now tends to indicate, I think, a little bit more of an interest in Bitcoin and digital from the alternative investment community.
Hmm.
Um, Clearly, there are people looking for better havens for value than uh, metals, things of that nature, but also looking for an alternative to plain currency.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah, it's my DMs consistently getting messages from people asking me like about Bitcoin or like how to kind of get started or what they should learn. Old friend reached out to me like, wait, what's this halving thing? Like, why would they do that? Like, I'm like, that's the way it was designed. Or like, what
Yeah.
supply? It's really interesting, to see that level. I always love when people ask questions more regarding um like educating themselves about Bitcoin as opposed to like how do I buy, right? Obviously buying is a part of the education, usually what I tell people in that regard is like, hey, just get a number that you can you can afford to lose, whether that be $5 or $100 or whatever you want, and just buy a little bit and see it go up and down for a second, and then try to get an understanding that way. Because if you put something like this isn't trading advice or financial advice, but just more of like, kind of how to get to know something through that, overall. So, one thing I want to talk about real quick, shifting from Bitcoin is, and back on the digital dollar perspective is, whether it be digital dollar or the bank, US bank, or sorry, financial institution, stable coins and so forth. What kind of privacy considerations are taken into account there, right? So it seems as though there's lots of concerns of, with there being a digital dollar or with there, whether it be a banking dollar, is that there's less privacy, or things essentially could be taken advantage of, from a user perspective.
Yes.
Are there any like security aspects that the individuals will have, or is it just that there will be less privacy when it comes to how people transact via that? I mean, obviously, it's going to be less privacy than a duffel bag full of cash, or just or paying cash to buy a cheeseburger. But just curious what your thoughts are, or what you know about that.
Well, certainly there are issues with privacy that have issues way beyond the financial markets, constitutionally. Um, how far down the road do you go in terms of determining whether your money's been used in an illegal transaction or not?
Hmm.
I think, what's the statistic? If for every $20 you have in your pocket, 5% of it has probably been used at one point in an illegal transaction.
Wow.
So, where is the line going to be drawn by regulators and in law enforcement as to when somebody may be aiding and abetting an illegal transaction? Maybe somebody has received the proceeds of an illegal transaction. We see some of these scenarios play out in some of the more, uh, I guess, oppressive cases that we've seen of people using privacy coins and things of that nature.
Hmm.
But there is an issue that, I mean, how much does the government really need to know about what you're doing with your money, and what are they going to do with all of that data? You start getting into the issues that frankly, I think Andrew Yang brought up very nicely during the campaign about the value of data,
Yeah.
and that people need to own their data. And if there is a digital dollar out there, how do people actually own the data that surrounds that dollar, that makes the basis of that block?
Sure.
Does it really belong to the government? That's a difficult question to think about, but um,
Right. Like, is
there's
yeah, like some notion of shared ownership of data because you're using the vehicle to transact
right,
seems crazy, but seems like an argument that could be made, right?
right, right, and we have statutes in the United States that extend liability for things infinitely. One of them is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. You're involved in an act of bribery of a foreign official.
Hmm.
I mean, that liability literally goes down the road to everybody working with a company. For simplicity's sake, there are some exceptions, but
Hmm.
if I am a company that's working with another that's involved in a bribery kind of scenario, and somehow I'm in that chain of funds, or I'm in that chain of that transaction, no matter how far down you go, you're going to be held accountable by the federal government.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure whether we have the resources or patience to deal with that kind of um, liability chain on a broader scale, or even if we want to. So there's got to be some medium, and I don't think anyone pretends to have that solution right now in terms of, if the digital dollar is created, how is it, where is this data being kept, and who actually has access to it and why? And not only that, how much can actually be created? We have a lot of uneasiness right now about the fact that the Fed is loaning billions of dollars to people, uh, literally through the idea that yes, we can print money and you will treat it at the value that you believe it's supposed to represent.
Right. Yeah. And basically print infinite money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which I think is, in terms of uh, the uh, coins that have been created by people, there's clearly some interest in making sure that wealth does have a perceived and actual value that's represented in truly by what you own. You start getting into those arguments about how much is your dollar really worth right now.
Hmm.
And you can get into all the stories about wage stagnation and what a lot of people would call stagflation. The fact that we have low inflation, but the real true value of a dollar hasn't really hasn't appreciated for most people who are making a living.
Right. Yeah. And basically because they're making, things going up, but they're making the same.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there is a future, I think, for digital currency. I think the digital dollar will definitely be something that the Treasury will be employing in some way. Secretary Mnuchin today actually came out and said that he would like to see blockchain used in the next triple P distribution. So,
Hmm.
uh, that coming from a government official, that's a pretty strong statement by someone recognizing the needs of government to have provenance over the funds it's distributing to people.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if we've ever, I know everybody wants the government to be accountable for all those things, but this is, I think, one of the first instances where somebody's actually said, well, we need a mechanism to do it.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
I think, you can look at it two ways. Is it an indictment of the government for not being accountable, or is it, the ability of the government to really recognize its own shortcomings?
Interesting. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens. And then it also goes back to like, yeah, the good and bad. Like what elements, um, what elements get kept,
Right,
or what gets used, what doesn't get used.
right.
Because I think we've seen we're seeing in China how they're thinking about digital dollar and blockchain, and how
Hmm.
um, it's just part of the plan, I guess, right, of more control and kind of the mo of that nation, I guess.
Right. Well, of course, the digital currency is linked with digital ID there,
Yeah.
which is, brings up a whole other set of issues.
Yeah.
Uh, I, I do think there is a need for digital ID. I'm not sure whether it's such that we should allow the governments to, of our nation, state, local, federal, to be able to program whatever they want into that ID.
Right.
Uh, you know, you know, uh, you know, Bob got a speeding ticket in 1987, therefore he cannot go into X, Y, and Z places. You can get into these random things that people can do with this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but um, how much data does someone really need to have in a digital ID? And do you want people to have an ID that's actually, you know, coexisting 24/7 in tandem with one's financial situation and wealth status?
Right.
Um, I don't know whether someone, somebody asks you for an ID at a, you know, at a bar or something, or DMV, they have no idea, how much money you make.
Right.
But that digital ID, if program, can really, create some very interesting class stratification, I would think. You start getting into some pretty Orwellian kind of
Yeah.
scenarios, and I think that's China. China, we always forget that the culture of the Far East is very different from that of the West in terms of how people look at their government and society. People tend to want to work in unison, think in unison. There's more of a conformity drive in that culture than you would have in the West.
Hmm.
So maybe those things have some value, but I'd still be pretty concerned about them being in the wrong hands. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And what, yeah, how did, I think over time we see how I had someone on my podcast a couple of days ago, Francis, doing of Rubica, and they work with personal
Hmm.
cyber security, and we were talking about how um, there's just so much privacy fatigue, right? And so we have privacy fatigue in how we operate online, and the OAuthing of certain things, and to get access to this thing, you have to connect this other thing. So it's like, it'll be interesting to think about from a digital currency standpoint. One is it at the consumer level where we all get privacy fatigue? Is like, oh, this is easier for payments, so we'll use this. Is it forced? You know, and how that goes overall. Again, like I just, to me, it just continues to prove the case for Bitcoin overall. But no doubt that's going to be the world that we're going to be living in, and some decisions that people will be making.
Absolutely.
And I don't think cash is going away tomorrow. I know a lot of people keep on dogging cash, but like, you got to also remember there's so many people that they only operate in cash, right? For whatever, whatever the job is, it's certain cash. So cash isn't going away tomorrow, but there definitely is. The payment methods are changing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole concept of an ATM, when you think about it, is sort of funny. So many people use a debit card that's through a bank or a service provider, and I mean, how often do you actually have to use cash to buy something, or to actually engage, to go to a store to buy groceries? Um, it's, for most people, they're acting cashless already.
Hmm.
There are places in the world that are not like that, though. And there are, sectors of our economy that are not like that. Gaming, of course.
Totally. What's really interesting, and I'm sure you're probably aware of this, but is that there's actually more cash in circulation right now than ever. And it's weird to think about, because people use credit card or some form of virtual payment more than ever as well.
Right.
But yeah, there's more cash in circulation.
It's
Uh,
somewhere, right? I mean,
yeah,
somebody's got.
yeah, yeah. Well, Bob, hey, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I'd love to leave the last question, and you're probably prepared for it, in the sense of, what's a question that you want to ask the audience that they should be thinking about as they go about their day?
I would ask the audience to consider whether Bitcoin in the near term will indeed be a sovereign hedge or not.
Hmm, I like that. Yeah, will Bitcoin be a sovereign hedge in the near term? I like that. I'm gonna. My answer is yes, but I don't. We'll see what everybody else thinks.
We'll see.
Bob, what are some good ways that people can get in touch with you, or follow you if they want to know more about you?
Well, certainly. I am on LinkedIn. I'm on Telegram. Uh, my firm's website, andersonkill.com. I'm happy to answer any comments, questions from the community on anything digital, and to
Awesome,
share my knowledge and expertise.
awesome. A virtual coffee.
Exactly.
There you go. Bob, again, thanks again. Everybody, thank you for listening to another episode of the TF podcast. Again, please make sure that you are following us on our social channels, at JG Product, at TF Blockchain, as well as please be sure to subscribe across our podcast channels. And if you like this, please leave a comment. fill in those 5 stars. It goes a long way, and let your friends and colleagues know about the show. We'll see you all soon. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.